The sun began to set behind the hills of Galilee, and a vast crowd followed Jesus. They were tired faces, empty hands, slow steps, yet eyes filled with hope. No one could explain exactly why, but something in them said that there, near him, the soul breathed better. However, as the sky grew darker, a problem rose silently. There were thousands of people, and almost nothing to eat. The disciples watched the crowd gathering on the grass. The hunger shown on their faces tightened their hearts. Philip, more practical, came near Jesus and quietly said, "Lord, we have no food for all these people." The worry grew as the evening wind blew. It was as if everyone's need had become greater than the faith they carried. Jesus looked at the crowd, and his eyes filled with compassion. It wasn't only hunger he sought, it was the tiredness of life, the hidden pains, the emptiness only heaven understands. He asked everyone to sit down, like someone preparing the heart for something great. But the disciples looked at each other, confused. How could they feed so many if they barely had enough for themselves? While concern was rising, Andrew walked toward Jesus with a small boy beside him. The child held a simple bag with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. It was little, almost nothing, but the boy offered it with a timid smile. It wasn't about quantity, it was about surrender. Andrew said, "Lord, here is what he has. It's not much, but he wanted to bring it." Jesus looked at the boy as someone who sees more than the eyes reveal. That simple gesture carried something powerful. Faith without measure, surrender without fear. The disciples watched, not understanding how 5 loaves could feed a crowd. But Jesus held the basket as if holding a miracle about to be born. All it took was a willing heart for the impossible to breathe. The disciples approached Jesus, hoping for some practical instruction, some logical answer to ease the weight of that responsibility. But he simply held the basket calmly, as if he could already see what no one else had imagined. The crowd waited in silence. It was as if heaven breathed along with every gaze fixed on the Master. Jesus then lifted his eyes toward heaven. His lips moved in a simple, sincere, deep prayer. He thanked for what he had, even if it was little. The blessing didn't come when the basket became full. It came when the heart became full of gratitude. The disciples watched in silence, unaware that the miracle had already begun quietly. Jesus broke the first loaf and placed it in the hands of his disciples. At first, nothing seemed extraordinary. It was the same simple bread from the boy. But when they began to distribute it, they noticed something strange. The basket did not empty. Every time they took a piece, another appeared. The multiplication did not come with noise. It came with constancy. The crowd began to receive the bread. First those closest, then the ones farther away. Children smiled, the elders grew emotional, and those who came only out of curiosity now saw God's hand moving before their eyes. The disciples exchanged looks of awe. The more they served, the more there was to give. The boy who had offered his small lunch watched everything with wide eyes. He had never imagined that his simple gesture would become the answer for thousands. And maybe that's why God chose him, because a willing heart is worth more than any great offering. Jesus walked among the crowd as the food multiplied. His eyes carried tenderness, love, and gentle care. He knew the hidden stories there, the anxious mother, the worried father, the lost youth, the weary elder. For each of them, the multiplication was not just food, it was hope. The disciples began to realize that the miracle had a purpose far greater than feeding bodies. Jesus was teaching that heaven responds when someone offers what they have. The size does not matter, the heart does. Faith does not begin when we see the answer, but when we place the little we have into God's hands. As they handed out the food, the disciples began to laugh. not out of disbelief but out of joy. Every basket that returned seemed even fuller. The multiplication never stopped. It was as if heaven was pouring its abundance before them, showing that God never gives back less than what he receives. People ate calmly, as if tasting not only the bread but the care of God. The hunger that once tightened their chest now gave way to a silence of gratitude. There, in that simple field, everyone felt they were standing before something eternal. Jesus observed every face. He knew who had arrived without faith and who had come believing. But in that moment, it didn't matter. He fed them all, because the love of God reaches even those who don't understand, even those who doubt, even those who came just to see. God's goodness always goes farther than we expect. It was almost night when the disciples realized that everyone was satisfied. There were no anxious eyes anymore, nor hands stretched out in hunger. The entire crowd had eaten, and not just eaten, but been filled. Thousands of people received from heaven far more than they ever asked for. Then Jesus told them to gather what was left. The disciples walked from side to side, collecting every piece, and in the end, they counted 12 baskets full. It wasn't coincidence, it was a sign. One basket for each disciple, as if Jesus was saying, I don't multiply only for the crowd, I multiply for you as well. The disciples held those baskets as someone who holds a revealed secret. The God who multiplies for many also cares for the small detail for the few. In the silence of that gathering, they understood that nothing would ever lack while they walked with him. The crowd began to rise, carrying bread in their hands and hope in their hearts. Many left smiling, others crying, others holding their families close. Each person carried the mark of the miracle, a reminder that God still writes stories where the impossible tries to erase them. The boy, silent, held the empty basket that once carried his small meal. Now he understood that the little he offered had eternal value. Jesus came near him and touched his shoulder, blessing without needing words. Sometimes heaven speaks only through gestures. The disciples gathered around Jesus, still astonished. How? They asked, even knowing the answer went far beyond logic. Jesus smiled as if inviting them to look deeper. For him, the miracle was no surprise. It was the natural expression of the Father's love. The night wind blew softly as the Master walked among them. There in that simple field, faith had been fed as much as their bodies. The multiplication had not truly ended, because the real miracle had happened inside them. As the crowd began to disperse, Jesus lifted his gaze to heaven once more. It was as if he offered that moment to the Father, saying, "Here it is." They saw. The glory was not in the bread itself, but in the God who turns the little into abundance. The multiplication of the loaves was not only about food, it was about trust, about giving what we have even when it seems too little, about believing that God does the impossible with the small things we place in his hands. The boy, silent, held the empty basket that once carried his small lunch. Now he understood that the little he offered had eternal value. Jesus came near him and touched his shoulder, blessing without the need for words. Sometimes heaven speaks only through gestures. The disciples learned that God does not answer human logic. He answers faith. He does not ask us to understand, so he asks us to trust. The multiplication happens as we walk, as we serve, and as we surrender. The multiplication of the loaves also reminds us that God works in movement. The miracle did not happen while the disciples held the basket. It happened as they walked, gave, and trusted. Sometimes you wait for God to act while you stand still, but he calls you to walk by faith. Heaven moves when you take the step that seems small yet necessary. And there is something deep at the end of the miracle. 12 baskets remained. one for each disciple. It was as if Jesus showed that those who serve never lack, those who give never lose, those who trust always receive more. The leftovers were not waste, they were care. God always prepares something just for you, even when the whole crowd is blessed together. And maybe you are like that crowd, tired, lost, without answers. Or like the disciples, is unsure of what to do with so little. Or maybe like the boy, holding something small that seems useless. But God still multiplies. If this story touched your heart, share it. Someone out there may be facing a hunger that isn't of the body, but of the soul. And this message may be the bread that lifts someone today. Remember, God still multiplies the little, still transforms impossible scenes, and still surprises those who refuse to give up. On the channel, there are other stories that will strengthen your faith and remind you that God's care is never late. Because when God moves, even the impossible obeys.